This summer of fires in Montana as well as in California, and then beginning again a week and a half ago in the Golden State, those that are still raging out of control, has given us news that has been filled with heartbreaking stories of people returning to their property, but not to their homes because the places in which they lived have just been reduced to ashes. Even so, many of those interviewed, between tears, say, you know what? We have the kids, we have the cat, we have our lives, we have all that's important. Years ago in Salt Lake City, having been notified by the sheriff that we needed to prepare for evacuation as we lived in the foothills that had fires raging just south of us, I came as close as I ever want to be to imagine the trauma of losing one's home by violence. Just thinking that we would have to clear out of the path of a brush fire that was running up the face of the Wasatch Mountains was terrifying enough. And thankfully, of course, we were spared it as firefighters came and were able to battle it down. But oh, was it a trying experience. It was awful. To actually live through the awfulness of losing your home and tokens that provide for those memories is just simply unimaginable to me. And the reason I mention all of this is that if you can put such a scene into, as I have just described, into your minds, you are well on your way to understanding the context of our reading this morning from Isaiah. When we talk about the book of Isaiah, we're actually talking about 3 books in Isaiah. Some people say 4 books. This particular reading comes from what is known as 3rd Isaiah, and it was written after those who had been in exile in Babylon returned to Jerusalem. But instead of finding it as they had remembered it in all of its great glory, they saw the center of their religious life, the temple, as absolute rubble, having been destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar II and the Babylonians. The writer of this portion of Isaiah was basically standing in the middle of the wreckage and reflecting on where all of them now found themselves in life. Not unlike those folks in California and then Montana last summer, their devastation, instead of being crushed by what was in front of them, which would have been a reasonable reaction, this prophet heard from God something amazingly heartening. Not unlike those who seem to know a sense of calm, again because, well, the children and the pets are safe. This was just unbelievable. Their Ventura County house smoldering ashes, and they could still have a vision of some joy and peace. That's what we heard from Isaiah this morning. Keeping that image in mind for just a moment, let me take a couple minutes or so and step into the weeds for a little context on how I think all of this fits into this, the first season of the Christian year, because speaking of joy during times of great stress is something that we also find within the church. Advent, for around 1600 years, has had on this particular Sunday a real sense of joy immersed in it. Way back in Christian history, Advent was actually a mirror image of the season of Lent. In fact, it was known as St. Martin's Lent because it started on November 11th, St. Martin's Day. Good old Martin was the Bishop of Tours, which is a place just a little bit north of Paris in central France, or south of Paris in central France, and he died at the tail end of the 4th century. He was a very simple guy. He was tolerant of those who believed differently, and he was deeply devoted to the poor and the vulnerable. And so the church remembered him with great admiration and actually started St. Martin's Lent on his day. And it lasted for about 400 years. And Advent was seen then, during that time for the church, as an occasion for fasting and penitence in preparation for Christmas. And Christmas at that time was joined with Epiphany, and therefore it was a time of baptisms. So this is much the way that Lent was seen at a time ushering in Easter and the baptisms at the Easter Vigil. Again, it was a very penitential season. And just as there exists in Lent Laetare Sunday, it being the fourth Sunday in that season, the third Sunday, this Sunday in Advent, is known as Gaudete Sunday. I mention that because both of these Latin words mean the same thing. Rejoice, to rejoice, or be joyful. So even in a time of great penitence in the church in Lent would begin that day chanting a phrase that just brought smiles to the faces of everyone. Laetare Jerusalem, rejoice, O Jerusalem. And in Advent, Gaudete in Domino Semper, or rejoice in the Lord always. That, by the way, is pretty much the extent of my Latin. But it's important to see that they all were directing us to being joyful, joyful. And just as some wear rose-colored vestments in Lent on the occasion of the fourth Sunday, we light the rose-colored candle on the Advent wreath on this day. It's a lighten up kind of day. Despite being a time of repentance, which requires us to face head-on our imperfection and shortcomings, what can really feel like ash-laden rubble in our lives, there in the middle of what might be unflattering and regretful reflection stands this word, rejoice, rejoice. Now, back to Isaiah. Things not going well led to captivity in Babylon. Jewish history sees the folks of Judah being captured and then marched off to Babylon as a direct result of their disobedience to God and their sense of idolatry at the time 6 centuries before the birth of Jesus. So off they went as a consequence of their lives. They were released around 60 years later, and then all of them came back to Jerusalem. Again, it was arriving home that this portion of Isaiah that we heard this morning was written. So at that moment, they were faced with their own moment of stark repenting. And yet, while standing in the middle of the rubble of their religious lives, they were not called to feel lousy about themselves or feel guilty about themselves. Instead, they were called to hear the good news being voiced to them, and they were the oppressed. Their broken hearts would be mended, and liberty was now a gift in their very hands. Gladness, blessedness, rejoicing, and righteousness were the hallmarks of the day, even though they're standing in the ashes. That's what greeted the people of God 2,600 years ago, who had to have been overwhelmingly aware of the sheer devastation that had befallen them, basically because what they knew to be deep down inside as their sinfulness. And that's something. You and I have never had the experience of the people of the ancient kingdom of Judah being held captive for 2 generations in a foreign land. But boy, we do know those moments in our life when we think everything from, what could I have possibly been thinking, to, I behaved like a damned fool condemned by my own callousness and my own disregard of others. And sometimes it can be phenomenally difficult to stand in the midst of the destruction that you think you may have caused in life and relationships. But amazingly, what we hear is not unlike all of those who were held captive. Gaudete in Domino Semper. Or as Paul simply said in his first letter to the Thessalonians that we heard read a couple minutes ago, rejoice always, always. And so, just 4 days away from the darkest day of the year, and at a time in which the readings we've had from the Gospels over these last weeks have said an awful lot about repenting, maybe too much so for our comfort, we are folks not found in despair, but instead we are folks who go around lighting candles to rent the darkness and to fight off the guilt and to fight off the paralyzing remorse with the cry, rejoice, rejoice. And we do so because while repentance is something that literally means to turn around, it also more importantly promises that in doing so, we get to face something that is brand new. And that newness is for us through Christ, what those folks heard so long ago back in Jerusalem. Simply said, there is always good news, always good news, always broken hearts that are being repaired, always release from captivity and righteousness given to us to define every day. So, this coming Thursday, when we have but 8 hours, 20 minutes, and 34 seconds of daylight here in the Flathead, and the world feels cold, and it feels dark, and in fact feels darker than it ever is at any time of the year, we are people who know deep down inside that we can be joyful, for the light of Christ shall always prevail. Amen.